Let's continue with the last part of this credit. After requirements and the survey, let's look at the calculation, as it is an important part to understand this credit. I've broken this down into 3 examples. Let's start with example number 1. The data provided is as follows. You have an office building with 100 regular building occupants, and all occupants were asked to complete the alternative transportation survey for a 5-day week. 40 occupants responded, and some of the 40 respondents did not work all 5 days because of illness, leaving a total of 392 trips. And of this, 196 were via mass transit. Determine the alternative transportation rate. And before we get overwhelmed with all of the data, let's just break it down. The data that's been given, the data that we need, is all there. First of all, we have to realize we're working with a full population rather than a sample. There are 100 occupants, 40 respondents, 392 trips made, and 196 via mass transit, which equals alternative transit. I will break down the calculation for you in 6 steps. Step number 1 is determine the number of trips via alternative transport. In this particular case, it's 196, and this number was given in the data. Sometimes you may have to calculate this. Step number 2 is determining the raw alternative commuting rate. This is the rate based on the survey alone. So relatively straightforward, 196 trips via mass transit out of the 392, so 50%. After this, step 3, we determine the survey response rate. 40%. 40 respondents out of 100, straightforward. Step 4, in this particular case, we look up the extrapolation factor in the reference guide. A 40% response rate leads to a 60% extrapolation, and I'll explain to you how that calculation works. This is the crucial part of the calculation. Determine the total number of alternative trips, including the ones of the people that did not respond. The ones that responded, straightforward, 196. Now, how to calculate the ones that did not respond? We have 60 occupants that did not respond, times 2 for the number of trips that they made. Then we take a 60% extrapolation rate from the table, and we multiply this by 50%, and that's the number that we found earlier of the raw alternative commuting rate. We do this all together, we get 60 times 5 times 2 times 0.6 times 0.5 gets 180 for the non-responded part. We total this all together, and we get 376 as the number that we determined for the total alternative trips, including the non-responsive people. Step number 6, the last one, determine the overall rate and the number of points. So we just calculate the 276 alternative trips, divide this by the 100 occupants times 5 times 2 days, and you get a percentage of 37.6. And we can look this up in the table, just over 35%, so 8 points. And to get a hang of this, let's do this one more time for example number 2. Here we take a slightly different approach as I give you the data as we need it. We started an office building with 1,025 regular building occupants. And the question is the same, determine the alternative transportation rate. First one is to determine the minimum sample size. We have 1,025, which is between 1,000 and 2,000. So we must take the next increment to 2,000 increment. And that means that we need a sample size of 333. Next, this data is just as a given. We distribute the survey, decided on 500 to distribute to get at least 333. And in this particular example, as information I just give you, 340 people completed it. And we take that for our further calculations. And the next step, therefore, is to calculate the number of trips via alternative transport. And again, this data is provided. In this particular example, 170 trips via bicycle, 600 via public transport, and 300 via 2-person carpool. To calculate the alternative transportation rate, 170 plus 600 plus 300 divided by 2 for the 2-person carpool. Together, 920. Next up, determine the raw alternative commuting rate. So 920, we just calculated this, divided by the total amount of trips, so 340 times 5 times 2, 5-day work week. And that equals 27%. Now we can determine the reduction in conventional commuting trip. And because the entire regular building population was sampled in a statistically valid way, meeting the minimum thresholds, the project team may conclude that the sample of the alternative commuting rate is accurate, and therefore no extrapolation is needed. And therefore we can use the 27% and look it up in the table, and we can see that we earn 6 points. And actually what you can see is that it's not too difficult. But let's do one more example, this time with visitors included. So example number 3. The context is as follows. A building occupied with a grocery store opens 7 days a week. And the product team determines that the store has more daily visitors, an average of 400, than the regular building occupants, the regular workers, 20 employees. And the question remains the same. Please determine the alternative transportation rate and which amount of points can be earned for lead. These are the steps. So first of all, we break it down into regular occupants and into visitors. So start with the regular building occupants. Since it is small, all 20 people complete the survey, and you should push for this. And then we can determine the regular occupants' trips via alternative transportation. So again, this data is given to you by me. So 20 employees times 7 days times 2 trips, minus 40 were avoided due to absence, is 240 trips. And of that, 50 trips were by bicycle, 20 via carpool, 20 via green vehicle, and 80 via public transport, giving you a total of 170 trips. We continue by calculating the regular raw alternative commuting rate, 170, we just calculated it, divided by the total, 240, gives you 71%. Now we need to do something similar for the visitors. So based on the 400, the sample size must be 201. You can look it up from the table on the right. And in this particular case, I give you this data, 215 people completed it, so meeting the thresholds. Then we determine the visitors' occupant trips via alternative transportation. Again, I'll give this to you. So of the 215 trips, times 2, right, back and forth, 430, 70 were by bicycle and 100 by public transport, giving you 170 divided by 430 is 40%. The last part is to determine the overall alternative transportation rate. And we do this simply by taking a weighted average. So you had 20 regular people and 400 visitors, of in total 420. So for the regular, 20 divided by 430, that portion times the 71% that we calculated, plus 400 divided by 420 times the 40% that we calculated, giving a weighted average of 41%. We can look this up in the table and we can see that it's just above the 40% threshold, and therefore we get 9 points. The calculation seems somewhat daunting at the start with, but actually when you do a few of those, you will see that it's not too complicated. And this concludes the part on location and transportation, where we looked at first the requirements. In the second part, we looked at the survey and how to set this up. And in this part, the calculations. After this comes sustainable sites.